Good morning, everyone, and welcome to First Draft, where I talk with authors and journalists about their important work and the stories behind them. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square. Did you ever want to take a road trip and travel across America to see all the famous spots from sea to shining sea? My next guest did exactly that in anticipation of our 250th anniversary. And folks, needless to say, there is more to the history of our country than the original 13 colonies. Beverly Gage is a Yale history professor and author, and she has written This Land is Your Land, a road trip through U.S. history. She joins us today to talk about how she documented this experience and all the places that have made an impact on our history here in America. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor.
Thanks for having me, Susan.
Well, I have to say, you hit on something that's very dear to my heart, both as a history major and as someone who really loves to travel. And after my family got vaccinated during the COVID pandemic, the first thing we did was take a road trip from our home in Michigan all the way to California with many stops because we've been cooped up inside and we felt like there was no better way to take advantage of, this time to enjoy what our country had to offer. And it was great. My daughter was about to head to college and my son was in high school, and it was kind of a unique experience for us. Your road trip that you took with your own family, was very purposeful as we were heading to our 250th year in this country. And there is a really heated debate about what the history of this country is and what our history means and what it means for our future. So how did you get the idea to do this? And tell us just a little bit about how this came together.
Well, I'm a little bit like you, I think, in the sense that I have always loved doing this kind of travel. And as a historian, I have lots of fun stopping off, not only at the famous places, but at some of the obscure or local places where you can stop off and kind of get immersed quickly in a different world, both in terms of geography and in terms of time travel. So as I was thinking ahead to 2026, this idea of finding a way to tell all 250 years of American history through these road trips might give people a different way into thinking about our history, thinking about our historical discourse. I was quite concerned that our historical discourse, like so many things in this country, seemed to be devolving into two camps. One is, everything was great. America, the most amazing nation, only say great things. And on the other side, only the worst things that this country has ever done really matter. And those don't seem true to actually how history works, which is this very dynamic, complicated, rich process. And I also thought there might be a lot of people out there who wanted a way in to think about history a little differently.
Yeah, I thought, in reading some of the interviews that you've done on this book, I really was taken with your perspective that it's possible for us to reckon with the darkest parts of American history, with slavery and with our treatment of Indigenous peoples and so on, but still emerge with this love of our country and a deep appreciation for our democracy and for the promise of this country. And I don't see that those ideas are contradictory, but it seems like our debate in this modern time very much does pit us in two different camps instead of being able to see a more nuanced, view of our country. How do we bridge those gaps and take a full appreciation of our history, good and bad, and build from there?
Well, part of the project of the book was not actually necessarily to resolve that question, but to sort of put that tension at the heart of what a year like 2026 is all about. And also to go out on the road and see how it is that different people in different places, and in the particular historic sites, are really grappling with that dilemma. So I don't know that I resolved all of those contradictions and answers in the process of doing this, but kind of bringing them to the fore and putting them out there and looking at the many, many ways that Americans over time have both claimed and criticized their founding traditions, certain aspects of the country. The book is in part a little bit of an act of recovery of this conversation that has been going on since the very moment the country was founded. It opens with Ben Franklin saying, as the Constitutional Convention is closing, saying, is the sun rising or setting on this country? And that question has just been at the center of American politics and culture really since that moment.
Now, I thought it was fascinating that you took a page from George Washington, who also, hit the road to discover America. Obviously, the country was far smaller then, but, that was in the early 1790s and our country's infancy. And when we're still waiting on states to ratify our Constitution. And there were so many tensions then. Talk to us a little bit, because we had 13 original colonies. You took 13 separate trips. It definitely seems like Washington was at the forefront of some of this book.
He was. He's the opening character because, he has to be in some sense, but also because he was very interested when he became president in seeing this thing that they were starting to call a nation or a country, but that really barely existed in terms of national identity. The federal government was just being invented. And he both wanted to see the range of people and landscapes that were part of the United States. And then he also had the idea that people were going to need some set of symbols to rally around, and that he, as the first president, was probably one of those symbols. So I think he had an extra layer to his road trip, which is that he wanted people to see him, and he didn't just want to see things. That was not really my road trip, but I did find from Washington onward that there was a certain kind of common cause with other travelers in history who have gone out, tried to see the country, tried to understand it. The Marquis de Lafayette, lots of other figures who open chapters in the book who are traveling from one place to another and kind of remaking other places in the image of where they came from.
Right. Now, previously, you authored a book on J. Edgar Hoover, which you won the Pulitzer Prize for. You've also written about a terrorist incident on Wall Street in the early 1920s. So this is a real departure, your current book. How did you decide that this was, that you wanted to go in such a different direction here?
The Hoover book took me a long time to write and was full of kind of deep archival research. It took me more than a decade. And so I love doing that kind of history. But after that deep immersion, I thought I could try something else. And so I myself wanted a little break and wanted to, get out of the house and get out of the office. But I also wanted to test myself a little bit, test my writing skills, take on a new challenge, and to find ways of writing history that might connect in a more immediate way. The voice of the Hoover book, as with many biographies, even great biographies, is this kind of voice of authority, right? I am the scholar and I have looked in the archives and I say, and that's part of who I am as a historian, but I'm also a teacher and a mom and a citizen. And so this book was a little bit of an experiment in trying to combine all of those modes of engaging with history at once.
I know that you also noted that this book was kind of a callback to some of the trips you'd taken as a child near Philadelphia. And so what was that like to embark on something decades later, with your own child, and to kind of see things through new eyes?
I'm from Philadelphia, or right outside of the city in the suburbs there. And so I did grow up in a kind of history saturated place, particularly around these sorts of events. And the opening image of the introduction is my first historical memory, which is being dressed up as a peanut to march in a bicentennial parade at the age of 4, because my parents were, it was 1976, my parents were supporters of Jimmy Carter, the peanut farmer, and it was also the bicentennial. And so, there's something about Philadelphia that really makes you absorb some of that history. So I was going back to not only Philadelphia, but lots of places that I had visited as a child. One of the funniest things that happened, I took a return visit to Colonial Williamsburg. And then when I came home, I thought, I think I still have my 7th grade scrapbook from Colonial Williamsburg. And I went and I dug it out, and it was kind of funny because it was very meticulous and very interested in all the history brochures. And so I thought, wow, okay, so I have been destined to do this since 7th grade or so.
And I know you visited such a wide variety of places, museums, historic sites, roadside attractions, battlefield reenactments, of course, souvenir shops, which are everywhere. And, these are just the places that millions of Americans go to learn about our history and, enjoy what this country has to offer. But was there anything particularly surprising that you encountered, as you were finding all these different places where people are telling the story of our country?
Well, there are a huge array of models for how to do public history. There are government-owned sites, and sometimes those are federal, sometimes they're local, sometimes they're state. There are highly commercial operations that put history front and center. And then there are other places like Disneyland, where I spent some time, that we don't think of as being historic sites exactly.
But they have the Hall of Presidents.
Exactly. They've got all of this, both history background and then sometimes explicit stuff. And so I guess I was struck by the range of engagement. It's also interesting to go to places that tend to appear in our history at one very particular moment, and then to disappear a little bit. But when you go and visit them, so say the big cities of the civil rights movement, Selma or Montgomery, when you go to visit them, you don't just see their one moment in the textbook, you also see a little bit of what has happened since. And in those cases, it's been a real struggle since that moment. A lot of those famous civil rights cities are not in great shape these days. In other cases, you look at a place who at a moment in history was just this tiny, tiny little hamlet, was grown into a colossus. And so I was very interested in the relationship between the present and the past, and the way that you experience that so differently if you are actually out there on the ground as opposed to just reading about it in a book.
Yeah. And so in addition to, of course, visiting historic sites for our founding fathers, I mean, you made some very unique stops on this trip, like a nuclear silo, a sex commune. So how did you choose some of these more unusual places, alongside more of the obvious historic landmarks?
Well, I'm really a 20th century historian, so that I knew from the first that I wanted to write a book that was going to do the full sweep of history, and that a lot of the energy in the 250th year was going to be very focused on the revolution and the founders, and that's great. But I wanted to, both for myself and for all those people who don't live in the original 13 colonies, find a way to tell this big story of the country over time. And so some of the places I went are pretty obvious, as you said, but others are these moments and places that really capture something that's a little bit less well known about the American past. One of my favorite chapters is the trip that I took along the Erie Canal corridor in upstate New York, so from Albany to Buffalo, because in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, it was one of the most extraordinary places in the country, both in terms of its economic energy because of the canal, but also in terms of this incredible array of people who went there, lived in these little towns and cities along the canal, and really tried to reinvent America. So Frederick Douglass was there, and Susan B. Anthony, and John Brown, and Harriet Tubman, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and William Seward, and they were all just living there. And so what I liked about that is that places like Peterborough, New York, or even Rochester are not necessarily on everyone's sort of bucket list of places to visit, but you really can feel in those places this energy and this promise and these communities that for a particular moment in time really stood in for the nation at large. But yes, so the sex commune was a 19th century was a 19th century commune, in all of these utopian communities of the 19th century called Oneida. But their big community house is still there. And so part of it is a hotel that you can go stay in. And then they teach you all about the very strange practices of the Oneida community.
There is so much. We're such a big country. There's a lot of weirdness here, and that's wonderful. I mean, when I travel out west on like the extraterrestrial highway through Nevada and all of the Area 51, sites, and you travel through Death Valley with people that live in the most inhospitable, climate that we have in this nation, which obviously probably causes you to experience some pretty interesting things in the middle of the night when no one's there. I think, if you're a historian and you've traveled around the world, especially Europe, obviously we have civilizations far older than ours and so much history there, but we have so much land here, and so many people who were dreamers, and they headed out west, and they created these really interesting communes or societies. And I don't know that you could really experience everything, even if you went on a road trip for a year, because there's just so much out there, and really so much history that hasn't even been told yet. How do you get your arms around that as a historian, even in a country as relatively young as ours?
I think you're absolutely right that one of the things that you realize in a deep way, you might know it intellectually, but actually being in it is the fact that this is such a big country. You really feel that and experience that when you're driving in a way that's quite different than if you're, just flying around or sitting at home. And that's a really important insight, actually, because I think it suggests some of the challenges that have been at the core of the United States, from, whose land is it actually, to the incredible array of people and cultures and geographies and landscapes that are all supposed to be contained within this thing that we call the United States of America. So that's really what struck me as I was driving around, is that incredible variety, as you were saying, and yet that these places are also connected to each other. Part of what the book does is try to trace some recurring characters and some recurring themes that show up in places that you might not think of as being very connected to each other. One is, a poet who was born in Detroit, kind of grew up in Henry Ford's Detroit, ended up moving to New Mexico with her family because her father had founded a school called the Los Alamos Ranch School. And then in the 1940s, there comes the federal government coming in, turning it into Los Alamos as we know about it today. But she, like many, many Americans, is someone who combined all of these different worlds and experiences.
So we're in the middle of our 250th birthday, and we seem to be in a real moment of debate about our history, what it means, trying to reckon with it. We have a current presidential administration that has played a very active role in this debate with making demands of the National Smithsonian Museums, other national landmarks, changing long established interpretations of history, especially about issues like slavery or the January 6th riots, of course, in 2021 when Donald Trump lost the presidency. Where do you see these debates going, especially when they've taken on such importance in our modern politics?
Right. History is deeply contested in our moment. I think there are lots of other moments where that has been true too. I am no fan, suffice it to say, of dictates that have been coming down from on high about, only this kind of history, only that kind of history. I think one of the challenges in writing this book is I did most of my traveling between the beginning of 2023 and the middle of 2024. So particularly national park sites since that moment have started to look different than what I saw. I have been really shocked and appalled by the signs that are hanging in many national park sites now that say, if you see anything here that unduly disparages a fine American ancestor, report this site to your federal government. I do not think that that is the way that we want to be approaching history. But I think there are really core, interesting questions that are out there that we do want to debate together about how you have a narrative of a country that is as complex as the United States, that is as variegated as the United States. A lot of academic historians have sort of turned away from telling a national story because they're finding meaning in other places, in transnational, in the local. But I do think it's incumbent upon all of us to wrestle with these questions and of what the nation actually means.
Our history is extremely complicated. We're a vast country, and we've gone through an enormous amount of changes, both in geography, in foreign policy in the last 250 years. And with one of the wonders of history, I think, is that there are no easy answers, and we can still be debating things decades, centuries, millennia afterwards, and finding new meaning and new debates and uncovering new writings and artifacts that we didn't know before that, create a different picture than perhaps, we had known before. But at the same time, I understand, for people who aren't as interested in history, and it can be unsettling that there are no easy answers. It can be unsettling, this idea that it's not just my country, right or wrong, that there have been wrongs and we need to grapple with that. And so how can we, beyond just the crass political debates, that our leaders might be having, but just in our own lives when we're having these discussions, how can we balance having genuine patriotism for this country, but understand, having that appreciation of some of the really dark periods of our history?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that you actually can't understand even the figures that you want to understand, right? Even the founders, figures like Jefferson and Washington, you simply cannot understand them, their lives, the worlds in which they lived, the forces that shaped them, without contending, in particular, with slavery, racial slavery, also without contending with Indigenous dispossession, right? These were not side issues for them. They were fundamental parts of the world in which they lived and what they thought about. So I think there's that piece that whether you want these things to be connected or not, they are connected. They are intertwined. They have shaped each other. And to some degree, even when it is a kind of ferocious divide of power or of equity, you can still talk about this as a common history that everyone's got to weigh in on and contend with. So I just saw that at so many of the historic sites that I went to. One of the things that I really like about those sites is that, unlike, our kind of algorithm-driven online world in which everybody is getting pieces of what they already think they know and believe, these sites are just sitting there and their doors are open. Anyone can walk in. And so it generates a really different set of conversations that I think can be hugely generative.
It seems like one of the fundamental tensions that we've had in America is the push for progress and to be a more inclusive, pluralistic society, to expand the definition of what America means and who it's for, with, at the same time, this uneasiness about change, and that change can come too quickly, and that then somehow something is lost, and rights for some people take away from rights for others. And I see this playing out because it's died down a little bit, but for the past few years, there have been these fierce debates over whether we should take down certain monuments, whether we should rename, certain streets or buildings, because they were named for people who had a checkered past, particularly with slavery. And there was always, the argument that was put forth for that was that these are people, usually men, who should not be celebrated in this way because of some of the wrongs that they had committed. The argument against that was, you're destroying our history. This is part of who we are. And, sometimes it would devolve into, derogatory political debates. It's a natural tension, and it's something that we really have grappled with for so many decades in this country. How, as a historian, how do you see that debate over what should be celebrated? How should we mark our history?
Well, history is ever changing, both in the fact that, it never ends. So you're always at a different vantage point. One of the things that I really love about teaching in a university is that I see that vantage point changing from my students. So today's generation of students were mostly born several years after 9/11. They were all born in the 21st century. So they have a really different relationship, not only with the deep past, but with things that I experienced and went through that are actually history to them. And they're going to have their own take on that. And we're still learning all the consequences of that history too. So I think it is not only okay, but inevitable that these debates come up about who ought to be honored. And I don't think there's one hard and fast rule for deciding that. At Yale, about a decade ago, there was a big debate over whether to rename Calhoun College here, which was named for John Calhoun. And there was a really spirited campus debate about that. I ended up being part of a committee that said, look, you can actually differentiate between a figure like John Calhoun, right, the most outspoken defender of slavery as a positive good, and other people who might have just been embedded in the institutions of their time. And I do think those distinctions are really important. I think that different communities are going to come to different decisions about this at different moments. But I don't think there's anything wrong with changing historical interpretations. In fact, often we're learning quite a lot through that process.
I'm wondering about some of the conversations that you have with your students who, of course, went through the pandemic when they were very young. and probably missed out on some childhood road trips. And we're still kind of recovering from that period of isolation where people just aren't doing as much in the public sphere as they used to. Have you talked with them at all about, if they're interested in taking any kind of trips like this and really seeing history for themselves and meeting new people and meeting strangers who might become friends?
Right. Well, they seem to be interested, but of course, they might just be telling Professor Beverly exactly what she wants to hear. But it is really one of the goals of this book to encourage people to put down their phones, look away from the screens. Those can be great and they can be helpful and they can teach you a lot about history, but they're not the only way to engage. And one of the things that is really wonderful, I think, about the road trip experience is that while I did a lot of this travel by myself because I was doing research, most people do this together as a collective experience, as a family, with friends, with partners. And that's just a really wonderful way to have these conversations and deepen engagement, not only with the people you already know, but with all the other people who are there exploring some of the things that you're interested in.
Well, we are approaching summer, which is peak vacation time for most of us, and I'm sure that some people who are tuning in still haven't made their plans yet. Do you have any recommendations for some of the many places that you visited that you would say would be kind of must see attractions for anyone who might be inspired by your book?
Well, there are many. I loved my trip through the West, the Mountain West, the Great Plains, which took me up to a little town called Medora, North Dakota, which is in a beautiful landscape, the Badlands, and is also a funny history town that mostly celebrates Theodore Roosevelt. So there's lots going on there. It was not a place that I knew or had heard of. I think the civil rights tourism that is now available in places like Alabama and Mississippi and Arkansas, Memphis, that also is really stunning, and it's all really well organized into a civil rights trail. And then one of my favorite places was Dearborn, Michigan. You said you're in Michigan, is that right?
Yes, I am. So the Henry Ford Museum is right there, and lots of history.
Right. And I loved going to the River Rouge,
Yes.
which is Henry Ford's. It was once the biggest industrial facility in the world, was a huge attraction in its own right for that reason. But it's still owned by Ford Motor, and they still build the Ford F-150s in a little part of the River Rouge. And so you can go and just get this sense of kind of American industrial might in its heyday. And it's kind of an incredible place to visit.
Yeah, it is. And you also have some battlefields that are not too far in the River Raisin, right in that region. So there's a rich history there. So appreciate you giving a little shout out to.
Well, shout out to Michigan.
Well, Professor, thank you for taking time to talk with us. And let's put the book up there in case anyone didn't see at the beginning. This Land Is Your Land. It's available now. And thank you again for stopping by and taking so much time to talk with us about your book and your travels.
Yeah, thanks so much.